insight. But he said the traditional way to distinguish churches in the 90s and the 2000s. What is your view on predestination? What's your view on baptism? So predestination. What's your view on baptism? What's your view on the end times? That's a big one.
Yeah.
What's your view on the end times?
Right.
And then what's your view on spiritual gifts? Modern way to distinguish churches, church between churches, these questions. What is your view on the role of women? I'm presuming in ministry. What's your view on social justice?
Mm-hmm.
Big topic there. What's your view on spiritual abuse?
Mm-hmm.
What's your response to LGBTQ plus scenarios?
Yeah. Welcome to the Uncut Podcast. I'm Pastor Luke.
I'm Pastor Cameron.
And this is the Uncut Podcast, where we have honest, uncut, I forgot my intro. Honest, uncut, and conversations about faith, life, and ministry. There we go. I felt like there was a third thing there, but so it's one of those things that you do over and over again, and you eventually actually forget it. Like, if someone asks you for, like, I don't know, your social or your PIN or something like that.
I have messed up the Lord's Prayer while praying, like during, like praying in front of the congregation. Like, okay, let's all pray the Lord's Prayer together. Mm-hmm. Like, I messed it up. It's like kind of like the singer who screws up the national anthem in front of a big crowd, Oh,
can you see? Oh, can you see?
Jose.
Well, anyways, Cameron, we're sitting down to record this episode, and you ran across a kind of a question. Is it related with the podcast that he's associated with?
I'm not sure. I guess we'll see in upcoming episodes, but
maybe we can plug their podcasts.
Yeah, let's do that. I had started listening to a podcast from a couple guys a couple of Asian Americans who talk a lot about issues. They're all pastors, talk a lot about issues facing the Asian American church. And that's obviously not our culture, and we don't really have a strong Asian American culture here in Western New York where we live. And so it's a really interesting listen to me, although, there's a lot of familiarity just based on ministry, cultural differences within Asian American churches, and kind of more like, I guess, what we would be considered as like blue collar, white American churches. They're really interesting. Anyway, these guys are really insightful. I really appreciate the type of things that they talk about. They bring in a lot of interesting guests. I would love to know how they get their guests to come on their podcast, if they got to pay to do that or what. But it's called Off the Pulpit. And we'll link it here. And Thomas, one of the hosts, is a guy that I did a cohort with, a executive pastor cohort with a couple years ago now. It must have been 5-6 years ago by. Wow. And anyway.
Did you just time travel, Cameron?
A little bit. And I'm pretty sure, I know I'm not the executive pastor anymore. I don't think he's executive pastor anymore either. So, but anyway, he asked this question on his personal Facebook page, or not this question, but it was kind of more of a statement about the traditional ways in which churches are distinguished across eras or time periods. So like if you were to ask the question, well, what was the church known for in the 50s, the 60s? What was the church known for in the 70s? It's kind of its like own little era, the 70s. What was the church known for 80s, 90s, 2000s, all that. So here is, I don't know if this is his opinion or if he was just asking for insight, but he said the traditional way to distinguish churches in the 90s and the 2000s. So how would you know the difference between,
like, if you're church shopping and you're like, these are the key questions I need to know about this church to decide whether or not I'm going to fit here.
Yeah, maybe it would be like the questions that you would want to interview the pastor or the leadership about.
Right. Or you're scouring their website to try and figure out what do they think about this, this, and this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Those things maybe change over time.
Right.
Yeah. And so the idea here is, okay, well, what would have been those questions that you would have want answered in like the 90s in the 2000s, the early 2000s. And there'd be questions like this. What is your view on predestination? So it's like, am I predestined to be saved? Or I don't even know that predestined just totally encapsulates like soteriology, like the theology of salvation, or
are you
not,
Calvinist or Arminian?
Sure.
Are you double predestination? Da, 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 da.
Right. What's your view on baptism? So predestination. What's your view on baptism? What's your view on the end times? That's a big one.
Yeah.
What's your view on the end times?
Right.
And then what's your view on spiritual gifts? So as time goes on, and now we're in like the 2010s to 2020s,
yep,
where we kind of are now. Modern way to distinguish church between churches, these questions. What is your view on the role of women? I'm presuming in ministry. What's your view on social justice? Big topic there. What's your view on spiritual abuse? What's your response to LGBTQ plus scenarios?
Yeah.
So first, I thought it was an interesting question.
I think it's very interesting too.
And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I think let's talk about one. Is the list accurate according to time periods? What would you add or subtract anything to either of those lists? I have some things that I think I would like to talk about around those, like adding things to them.
Yeah.
And then maybe responding to like, maybe we could try and ask the question, maybe we can kind of forecast what the distinguishing questions people are going to be asking in the next
2 decades.
Yeah. So let's start with what do we think about the lists?
I think like it's pretty hard to, I'm trying to kind of like wrap my mind around, because like you only ever know your sphere, right? So I'm assuming that list makes a lot of sense in the broad evangelical kind of bleeding into Baptist, Protestant, not mainline denomination world. Do you think that those lists do you think that, because I've never really been in denominationalism very much, particularly back then. Do you feel like those lists change if you're in maybe a different sector of the church group? Like, do you feel like that accurately describes like the questions that people were asking in like some of the mainline denominations, or?
Yes and no, because I think that one of the benefits of denominationalism is that there's not a whole lot of question about what the actual stated theology is.
You're like, well, this is Presbyterian, or this is Anglican, or...
Right. It is written in, according to whatever your, guiding documents are. I came out of Methodism, right? In the Methodist Church. It was the Book of Discipline, which had everything.
Right.
And you could go to the Book of Discipline and you could get a definitive
answer
on what the church, the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church, believed on paper.
Yes, on paper, which is not always the same.
No, about that subject and that subject and that subject. And not every subject is covered, right? Because some of these things we would consider secondary theological issues. In fact, I think a lot of them are kind of secondary theological issues. And so, but if they're the questions that people are asking, then are they really secondary? I don't know. But what I would say is that the benefit of denominationalism is that generally what the denomination believes. Now, whether or not the individual church or the individual pastor or leadership team upholds those theological beliefs is a completely different can of worms that essentially is one of the major things that kind of just split the United Methodist Church.
Right. Well, yeah, like that's the thing is like, as we're talking about this, I'm like, well, like there have been like over the last like decade, there have been significant, splits, shifts, changes in the mainline denominations over some of those issues.
Yeah, 100%. Well, and you could you could take any of those four things from the 90s and 2000s to 2000s, 2020s, and you could say you were a person who was coming here, interviewing the pastors to see what they thought on these issues. Imagine them sitting down with us in my office, and I have a Methodist background, educated at Wesleyan undergrad, Wesleyan seminary. You came from Moody,
which is dispensational yet kind of Calvinist yet conservative, like just kind of all over the place.
But not necessarily. You're not necessarily like a born and bred Calvinist, or born and bred dispensationalist.
Definitely not.
In a non-denominational church such as ours, which we serve, you could sit down and you could have the Wesleyan perspective on baptism, but you could have a Baptist perspective on the role of women, or you could have a progressive view on LGBTQ plus scenarios, or you could have a very conservative view on them. And all of those things kind of like mix and match into this theological and methodological stew that you find in an individual church. And it's not, it doesn't align itself with one particular theological tradition. So to answer the question, non-denominationalism makes it really confusing because you don't know what you're getting.
Right. And then you've got to, so you as an individual person have to you have to come up with your own book of discipline, as it were, or standard of what am I going to accept, and what are the major categories that I want to know that my church aligns with,
and what am I willing to disagree with, and still be there. We talked a lot about that on this podcast, just about like primary, secondary, tertiary theological beliefs, and what breaks unity and what doesn't, and what's going to make me go to another church and what's not, and what can I live with and what can I not? And, sometimes, I mean, like, to be perfectly honest with you, sometimes I don't know what I believe about these issues, or my thoughts change. Over time. My thoughts have drifted on baptism, primarily like who I'll baptize and who I won't. In particular, their age. My thoughts on baptism have changed in regards to and they're still changing, and I still am unsure. But what is the role of catechesis in baptism? In baptism, both pre and post. And so, so it's not even as simple as being well, what do you believe on baptism? Okay, that's what you're always going to believe on baptism. Yeah, I'm coming here.
So I think that that 90s list, I think it was definitely because what was it? It was view on spiritual gifts. Predestination. Baptism.
End times. And spiritual gifts.
End times was a big one there for a long time.
It was huge.
Because of Left Behind. Left Behind. Are you Jerry B. Jenkins? Are you gonna is Nikolai Carpathia going to take over the world?
Wow, you read them, didn't you?
Oh my gosh, I went to his college. No, I read the teen version, Cameron. I read the teen version. My mom read the adult version, but Jerry Jenkins is heavily involved in the upper leadership. But we had a building named after him.
I did not know this
at our college.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he was is on the board. I don't know.
I guess that makes sense now, Moody being a dispensational school.
So he's, it was, all the students joked that it was Moody Publishing's worst decision to not publish his books, because they weren't published through Moody. They were published through somebody else. I mean,
financial decision. Yeah, for sure.
But he's, supported the institution a lot and stuff like that. Anyways, I don't really know that much about Jenkins, but I know more than the average person maybe, but I'm going down a rabbit trail.
Are you embarrassed now for revealing how much you know about the Left Behind series?
A little bit. I mean, I watched those. I watched that first Left Behind movie with
I hope Kirk Cameron's not watching the podcast today. He's gonna be real disappointed in our opinion.
I couldn't make it through the Nicolas Cage one though. I got 10 minutes into it. I had to turn it off, and which is unusual for me. I'll watch just about any Nicolas Cage movie. But what were we talking? Oh yeah, not dispensationalism, but like end times. Like, is it amillennial? Is it post-millennial,
pre-millennial,
pre-trib, post-trib?
Oh my gosh, Mike.
And that was a big one. People were really like, people will still get.
Oh, they get fired up about that.
Mm-hmm.
Fired up. Like, you are not a Christian if you don't believe in the rapture.
Right.
I don't believe. Like, I am not a rapture apologist. I don't believe in the rapture. Like,
really?
No, I don't. Like, I don't. Not in the classic Left Behind sense. Like, when you say rapture, what do people think?
Oh, they think like
you're gonna walk into the room and there's gonna be clothes there. Like somehow God just took me naked. Like, he's like, nope, you don't need that Patagonia fleece in heaven. I'm taking you naked, boy. Like,
I have stories about that.
I know that there are like youth groups in the 90s who pulled pranks on people of like setting out a bunch of clothes and convincing people that they missed the rapture. And like, as far as that type of rapture is concerned, no, I don't believe in it. I don't believe that it's firmly established in Scripture. I don't believe that it was a firmly established theology or belief in the history of the church. Do I believe that we will be all caught up into the air with Christ? Yes, but that's not like
what does that mean?
Right. That means, when Jesus comes back, we're going to be with him.
Yeah.
Right. Like, not that somehow I'm going to disappear from the earth and there's going to be a bunch of people walking around.
Like, cars will crash, planes will crash, and, everyone's going to be like, what happened? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, like, nope, don't buy it. Don't get it.
Yeah. I don't know. Cause like, it's like one of those topics that was always last on the syllabus in all of my, which is surprising because I went to a dispensational school, but all that end time stuff was always like the last thing you talked about in theology class. And so if the professor was like running short on time, it was the part that always got skipped over because
that should tell you something.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, like, I don't mean to be like snippy or facetious about it, but like that should tell you something.
Yeah. No, it's, I think the.
Do you believe in the rapture?
I don't know.
Do we need to talk about this?
I actually don't know, Cameron. I'm like, I don't know. I kind of like, I was in the Evangelical Free Church of America, and they were a like pre-trib. I think they were like a strong like pre-trib, or was it?
Which, if you're listening and you're not exactly sure what we mean, like that the rapture will happen pre or before the tribulation.
Yeah. And
which is also I won't comment. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I was kind of like, I don't know about that because I was in the denomination and I was kind of like, should I seek ordination through the denomination? Because that was the denomination I was serving under at the time. And the denomination had like a vote a couple years ago now, and they had a vote and they decided to change the language of the belief statement from pre-trib return to glorious return. Christ will have a glorious return. And essentially, they just say, like, you need to believe.
So says the Bible.
So says the Bible. You need to believe. You need to believe that Jesus is coming back, and that's the requirement for participation in the denomination. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I can do that. And so that's kind of just where I've kind of been. I'm just like, I don't know, and it's never been the theological topic I've really been all that interested in. Mm-hmm. And so I don't actually know what I really think about that.
Yeah.
I think I'm not the...
We are just building future podcast topics.
We are right now. I don't think I'm. What's the one where you think we're in the millennium now, and we're just building?
Isn't that amillennialism?
Amillennialism.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm amillennial. I can say that with some certainty.
Yeah.
Partly because that has been kind of. It's that theology has been tied to some bad sociological movements spurred by Christians in the past. Mm-hmm. This kind of belief that we're all progress is good progress because we're in the millennium and we're building the church and we must continue to. I don't know. It kind of bled into imperialism and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I just generally don't like that one. But but anyways, there was this other topic that I was going to ask you if you felt like it needed to be added. And you would be a better person to ask than me because you're older than me. But I can't what's the theological term for the debate over whether or not God can change his mind? Do you remember?
It's on the tip of my tongue. I don't remember off the top.
Immutability?
The immutability of God, the changeability of God.
Changeability?
Yeah, immutability. That's what it is.
Was that I was told by different people that at different points that's been a big dividing issue. Was that, does that make that list to you?
No.
No?
Not in my experience, no.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a topic of conversation for us dorks at theology school, but it wasn't it wasn't a distinguishing question that I saw in the church.
Yeah. Are you a Molinist, Cameron?
Yeah, I'm not. No.
We're going to send some people down really weird rabbit holes if they start Googling Molinism.
Yeah. No, it is a good question. I have some thoughts on the immutability of God, the changeability of God. Mm-hmm. I was just reading, in my personal reading back through the Old Testament right now, and was just reading yesterday or so about Abraham's conversation with God in regards to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yep. Yeah.
He has kind of the same conversation with Moses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because God's gonna
God's like, I'm destroying everything.
Yeah, he's gonna kill all the Israelites after
gone.
having just saved them.
Yes. Say bye-bye. Say bye-bye. And and with the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah too. Mm-hmm. And Abram's like, yeah, but is that really in line with your holiness?
Yeah. Well, they go back and forth.
They do.
They God keeps.
How about 1,000? How about 100? How about 50? How about 10? How about 1?
Yeah.
And every time God's like, okay, maybe that's not exactly the tone.
Sure.
But the reality there is that it seems as though God. Here would be my way to talk about that, is not that God is fickle, but that God allows himself to be moved, so to speak, by his children.
Yeah.
It's not that God doesn't know. He's like, heaven and hawing up in heaven, doesn't know what the best thing is.
Right.
It's that he, like a child is moved, like a parent is moved by the request of their child. God is moved by the request of those he loves and cares for.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons that we believe in that God hears our prayers and listens and answers. Right? Is not because he's unwilling to do something. Right? And we cajole him into doing it, but because he loves us. If you as a father, if your child is hungry, do you give them a stone? No, you give them bread. Why? Because you love them and they have asked. So no, I don't remember that being a distinguishing mark in the church. What I was going to say in terms of that first list is, if I had to add something, it's maybe not so much a theological topic as it is a methodological topic, but I would talk about the rise and the pervasiveness of the church growth movement.
I was thinking worship style.
Certainly. Maybe a separate post or separate, Thomas, if you end up listen to this, a separate post, a separate topic of conversation, be not so much, because these are all pretty much theological. Well, no, they're not theological. Maybe they are. I don't know. The second list is not so much theological, I don't think, as the first in my mind, but you could probably push me on that and I would change my mind. But there certainly is ministry methodology and ministry philosophy things that distinguished churches in those two eras as well.
Yeah.
And I was going to say the church growth movement, I feel like, is one of them. Worship is one of them.
Which those two are closely linked.
Yes. The nature of evangelism or the method of evangelism, I think, is one of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm talking about like the rise of the Bill Hybels. By the 90s and 2000s, that was already like kind of firmly established in the Rick Warrens.
Yeah.
And not even so much the personalities, but the methodologies.
Do we do a Sunday school? Do we do a small group? We're
seeker sensitive. We're purpose driven. We're, we're moving away from small community church.
We're orange.
To
we're sticky.
Right. Moving away from small community churches to big mega churches as the desire of every church and every pastor.
Yeah.
Church growth. If we're not growing, we're not being faithful. If we're not growing, we're not being fruitful.
Yeah.
If we're not growing, if we're not big, we're not making a difference for the kingdom or for the people or the community or whatever. And I think that I see the reason I talk about that in that time period is because I feel like we're seeing less of that.
I feel like people are arguing about it less.
What do you mean?
Like some of we saw that post the other week, you and I did. Somebody was talking about like church size and was giving some like apologetics for like big mega churches. And some of the criticism, the interlocutor that the post was engaging with was, we felt like kind of outdated, like a couple, like a decade or two behind the question. It was kind of like, well,
Acts was a megachurch.
Acts was a megachurch. Like, more people means more gospel. Like all those questions. I was like, those aren't questions I think most people are asking. Most people are asking the questions that are on that second list, or I would addend to that second list of saying, well, doesn't large churches create places for spiritual abuse, unhealthy leadership, et cetera, et cetera?
Or in a response to our podcast, I think from last week, does large megachurch provide the best
place for discipleship? Yeah. Yep.
So I feel like the conversation is happening less around or at least there's a turn towards, and maybe this is what the next era turns towards and becomes a distinguishing mark, is like there's a turn towards a more organic, smaller, intimate, intentional model rather than a build it big, build it better, get more people into the same room, and become a big place. Now, I am not an anti megachurch guy.
Yeah,
I'm not. I think that I think it was Tim Keller that was talking about
the gospel community,
the ecosystem of the gospel, and how that was in that.
They
podcast.
Mentioned it in the podcast that we listened to the other week, and we kind of
where did I hear that?
But this idea that a community needs all different types of churches: big churches, small churches, monasteries, nonprofits, house churches, and all of those serve to meet all the different people in their different parts of their faith journey. Yeah. I do think, though, like the trend, unless the trend changes, this has been the trend for the last several years, and I think is speeding up. I think COVID sped it up. The trend has been smaller churches are disappearing and mega churches are getting bigger. So that's been the trend so far, at least in recent times, is that it seems to be that we're consolidating. Centralized. This is my kind of negative, I'll be a little negative. I think this could be, I hope that this is wrong, but I could see the rise of what we could call as like branded churches rather more than denominational focused churches. So like this kind of already exists with churches that are like Hillsong, whereas Hillsong functions more as a brand than it does a denomination. And the rise of churches like that, so big successful churches who create something that's closer, and I'm being a little pejorative, so like by calling it a brand and not like a church group or something like that. But then you kind of consolidate, like do you go to Wegmans or Tops? Kind of become something more along those lines. And then, there will always be the people who are like, no, like diehard small local church. But those will become less and less as the bigger churches and as less people go to church in general, because we're just seeing a sharp decline in church attendance and seeing an uptick in the amount of people who go to megachurches.
What is the definition or the difference between a branded church and a denominational church?
I don't really know, other than that's why I'm saying that maybe I'm being a little pejorative unfairly here, because
I was trying to think. I think Hillsong's a great example, but I was trying to think of another example.
Right. Bethel's kind of there. They do have, they're not as well, there's not as many, but you can have a church underneath Bethel. There's Acts 29.
Are they still a thing?
They are still a thing, okay. I think. They've kind of, I've kind of stepped out of that, paying attention to that community a lot.
The Harvest Association?
I think,
out of Chicago.
Did they dissolve? They may have dissolved after James McDonald's ugly exit. So I don't know.
Could be.
Or they're all like vertical churches or something like that. Yeah. That's what they
Vertical Church Network or whatever.
The Vertical Church Network. So I don't know if that's still
there's
a thing
like these
or not.
associations or networks of churches. Right? They don't call them denominations. We're networks.
Right.
ARC, Associated Related Churches.
Yeah.
Harbor Network, Converge Network.
Yep.
Those are all networks of churches.
There's like another one that's like a new thing. New Thing Network. I think that was a thing.
The SBC.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Like,
what are they?
It is an interesting question because they do have belief statements that they ask all their leaders and churches to adhere to. There is generally a leadership structure, and there's less. I think there's usually less, but there's usually at least a top-down structure. I think the thing that's kind of lacking in some of those is that there's not always a bottom-up structure. So in a lot of denominations, there's room or the ability for people to kind of exercise authority upwards and affect the denomination positively through accountability from the lower ranks. Whereas I think, like, if you're a Hillsong church, you're like, I don't think you're able to say, like, make Hillsong over in Australia change policy or do something. Like, you're kind of agreeing to operate underneath their, like, LLC and all that stuff. Yeah. And so in that way, I think that's maybe one of the biggest differences that I would maybe say is that there's less mutuality in the way that it's led, and it's a little bit more top down rather than top down and bottom up. Maybe.
Okay. What about the second list?
I think that's pretty. That's pretty accurate. Because it was what women in ministry, social justice,
the role of women, social justice, spiritual abuse, LGBTQ plus.
Yeah. I think we don't see a ton in our area of our view on social justice necessarily. It's not a question that I think we get asked very often, if at all. But I know it's a big one in other areas, other regions and things like that.
I think I would want more on the topic. Or more about like
what that exactly is.
Yeah, like if someone were to ask me what's your view on social justice, I would want to know, what do you mean by social justice?
Right.
Like, what do you think of when you think of social justice? What do you What are you actually asking?
Yeah.
You know, do I believe that God is a God of justice and that the church can be on the forefront of pursuing justice for disenfranchised, ostracized, marginalized people?
Yeah.
100%.
Yep.
Right? 100%. How is that pursued by a church? I think is the question for me.
Yeah.
Do we pursue it through pursue it through what I would loosely call gospel-centric, gospel-oriented endeavors, programs, whatever? Or are we saying, no, it's important for social justice reasons for churches to engage in and enter into the current political system,
right,
in order to gain traction on what we believe are social justice issues?
Right.
That, for me, would be the more pressing question.
Yes.
But I would want to know, too, what that meant.
Like what that meant.
What do you mean by social justice?
Right.
Also, what do you mean by the role of women?
Right. Are you talking more broadly to, like, are we talking about the role of women, like, in marriage, like complementarian versus egalitarian? So, or are we talking about just in ministry inside of the organizational part of the church? Do they get to be elders, pastors, etc.?
Yep.
Would you add anything to that list, that second list?
I don't think I would. No, I don't think I would, but I would agree with your previous statement that those questions are going to be more prominent in different areas of the country or the world.
Yeah.
Even those questions are not ones that we usually get here in Western New York, or at least in Chautauqua County of Western New York.
We'll still occasionally get some of those questions from the first list that are kind of maybe older every once in a while.
It's really interesting it's an interesting sociological statement about this area.
It is. But there's one thing that I would add to both of those lists. Okay. And it is, are there people who are like me at this church? Like, I've seen more people leave a church because they're like, well, I'm kind of the only person in my age group, or I'm the only person with kids this age, or I kind of would prefer it to be more along with the music style, or like whatever that I would kind of prefer. I've seen that. I think that's a kind of an unstated question that a lot of people ask, and maybe I'm unfairly shifting into more of like what people use as a deciding factor as to whether or not going to participate in a church, and less how they distinguish. I think the original post was like, how do you distinguish churches? I think that's maybe, I'm probably shifting into a category of like, how did people decide whether or not to be at a church? But yeah.
I'll agree.
Yeah.
Any more thoughts on that topic or that question or that?
I mean, I think we could keep talking about it. There's a lot to talk about there. What do you think the future of that list will be?
I think one of the future questions or views on that list will be around like the nature of discipleship. Yeah. How do we go about making disciples in the most effective way? Yeah. A la the John Mark Comer, Carey Nieuwhof conversation that we referenced last week, and the pathway to discipleship and the critical journey, and like what do we expect out of disciples or apprentices to Jesus, and what is the purpose and the place of the church? That's a pretty question that pretty much every era has had. But especially in terms of like as the place or the body through which people are discipled. So I think discipleship and like a kind of return to the old way, the old ways is next thing.
Yeah. I think like the flip side of that coin might be like it's asking the same question but differently. Is I feel like there might become a time when people ask, is this church online enough for me? You know, so it's kind of like the two ends of the spectrum maybe, or kind of like maybe the broader way to ask that is like, is this church making disciples the way I want to be discipled?
Ugh, that makes my stomach hurt.
Which part of it?
Like, is this church online enough for me? I get it. I mean, I get like why that's probably a question that's going to be distinguished. That's going to distinguish churches. But we've talked about this before. Like, I'm a big Craig Groeschel fan, right? Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
I think VR church is redonkulous. I think it's dumb, and I think it is.
Come on, man! Apple Vision Pro.
I get it.
It's the next wave of computing.
I get why Craig's doing it.
Yeah.
But I'm like, it ain't it.
Yeah.
It ain't it. And I don't even think this is just like it's not a thing for Conduit and Cameron Leinhart, but it must be a thing for Life Church and Craig Groeschel. Like, no, it's not a methodology thing for me.
Yeah.
I think it's like I think it's theological thing for me.
Yeah. You feel like it's crossing into that line of like, all right, we have gone too far in disassociating our physical selves from each other and from the ministry.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Like, so I get it. And I think you're right. It's not a question that's going away. Or it's not a distinguishing thing that's going away.
Right.
But I think the question for me, or the question that hits me with that is like, how prophetic of a voice are you willing to be in that as it goes in that direction?
Right. Like, am I willing to call that out, or am I just going to say, not for me, and go my own direction?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel passionate about that. I really, really, really do. So I feel like I'm going to be calling it out. And I know that, that's probably going to be unpopular for some people, but I don't know. Like, I don't think that I'm just like a curmudgeon who doesn't like technology.
No.
I don't feel like that. I feel like that there is that it's actually a real thing, but I don't know. People can disagree, and we can agree that they're wrong and move on. So.
All right. Well, send in your questions about VR Church for Cameron.
Yes, please, Craig. We can settle this on the jiu-jitsu mats, bro. Yeah.
That is like your life goal.
Yeah. Yep. Well, thanks for listening, as always, for being here. We will tag the Off the Pulpit podcast, and appreciate that little teaser for our conversation, Thomas. Thank you. Appreciate your podcast. If you're not subscribed to the Uncut podcast, please subscribe, like, share it, rate it, no matter where you're listening or what you're doing. If you have any questions for us, please, you can use our text line, 716-201-0507.
That sounds right.
Okay, you're going to have to...
I'll fix it if it's not.
And we'll catch you on the next episode.